this is my chance, and I want, I know like some of the fighters, like boxing fighter, they're not fighting in Madison Square Garden for the money or just for the victory.
The combat sports universe just experienced a complete earthquake. Islam Makhachev, the absolute apex predator of mixed martial arts, just pulled off something nobody saw coming. Championships, reputations, and allegiances all got thrown into chaos, but here's the kicker. The real bombshell isn't even about his PFL move. It's the controversy that basically forced his hand to leave the UFC entirely.
They all won 50 grand.
Well, Dana, in the end, a much more dominant fight for Islam than maybe we thought. I thought maybe it was going to be a bit more 50-50.
I agreed with you.
What did you think of his performance, Jack's performance, and the whole fight?
Yeah, I mean, not the most exciting title fight you'll ever see, but let me tell you what, complete...
So this announcement just dropped, and it literally shattered everything we thought we knew about MMA. We're talking about one of those moments that splits the sport into before and after. Islam Makhachev, who's been absolutely steamrolling the UFC welterweight division and previously dominated lightweight with 4 straight title defenses that put him in the same conversation as legends like Khabib Nurmagomedov and BJ Penn, just walked away from the organization that built his global reputation, the Professional Fighters League, which has been Dana White's biggest nightmare in terms of competition, somehow managed to do the impossible. They snatched the consensus #1 pound-for-pound fighter right out from under an organization whose president had been singing his praises like he was the second coming of MMA greatness.
Yeah, I love to hear that. Okay, Islam, I'll ask you the big question to start. Why did you decide now was the time to move up to welterweight? I know we've talked about this for a very long time. They offered you the fight at UFC 300 with Leon Edwards. You couldn't do it at that time. Why was now the time to make this move?
The timing here is absolutely devastating for UFC's master plan heading into 2026. Just a few weeks back, everyone was speculating about Makhachev headlining this legendary White House card that Dana White had been hyping as the most significant event in promotional history. Now that entire dream scenario has completely crumbled, leaving the UFC desperately scrambling to find someone who can even come close to filling the massive crater left by the Dagestani Dominator's exit.
Or if Tapuria catch him, we're gonna sleep, And 2 options. Who is gonna make the game plan working?
Yeah, there's never been a 2-time lightweight champion.
We need to really understand what just happened here. This isn't just some random fighter chasing a bigger payday. We're talking about the 11th 2-division champion in UFC history. Someone the organization was literally building their entire future around. His numbers are absolutely insane in a way that speaks louder than any promotional hype. The Dagestani Destroyer sits at 28 wins and just 1 loss, with that single defeat happening way back in October 2015 against Adriano Martins. Since that stumble, Makhachev has been completely unstoppable, putting together a 16-fight winning streak that matches Anderson Silva's UFC record for consecutive victories inside the octagon.
Mike Bond joined now by the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. It is Islam Makhachev. Also, Islam, you might be #1 traveler right now. I feel like I see you everywhere. You're in Munich, you're in Azerbaijan, you're going everywhere.
Yeah. What's up, guys? I enjoy my life now, traveling a lot. Last 2 weeks, I was in the many beautiful place.
Those exact words came straight from Dana White's mouth just weeks ago after Makhachev's complete domination of Jack Della Maddalena at UFC 3. The irony is almost too bitter to swallow. The fighter White was positioning for greatest of all time. Conversations just decided to build that legacy somewhere else entirely, leaving the UFC president dealing with what might be the biggest public relations disaster in the company's history. That November destruction of Della Maddalena marked Makhachev's welterweight debut and his coronation as a 2-division champion. The judges didn't even hesitate, scoring at 50-45 across all 3 cards. Complete tactical annihilation of a dangerous champion who had been getting better with every single fight. Makhachev completely overwhelmed the Australian with takedowns and ground control for 5 straight rounds, completely shutting down the striking arsenal that Della Maddalena had been using to destroy opponents during his meteoric climb through the welterweight division. But apparently the writing was already on the wall long before that dominant performance at Madison Square Garden. Sources close to the situation are saying the negotiations that led to this shocking exit actually started gaining serious momentum after Makhachev turned down a quick turnaround welterweight title defense at UFC. The Dagestani champion said he needed more preparation time after his November battle, explaining that he'd rather return somewhere between April and June 2026, maybe even at that massive White House card that had fight fans losing their minds with excitement. This timeline apparently clashed hard with the UFC's aggressive scheduling demands, and that friction created an opening that the PFL was more than happy to exploit with an offer that Makhachev and his team simply couldn't walk away from. Nobody's talking specific numbers on the PFL contract, but industry insiders are whispering that this deal represents the biggest guaranteed money any mixed martial artist has ever received from an organization outside the UFC. The PFL, backed by serious investment money and a clear mission to break the UFC's stranglehold on elite mixed martial arts, apparently decided that landing Makhachev was the kind of statement that could completely reshape how this sport operates. This signing represents a massive shift in power that many experts predicted would happen eventually, but nobody expected it to go down this suddenly or this dramatically. For years, the UFC has operated like the undisputed king of mixed martial arts, either buying out or completely destroying any organization brave enough to challenge their supremacy. Strikeforce, Pride, WC, and countless other promotions either got absorbed or became completely irrelevant against the machine that Dana White and the Fertitta brothers built into a global empire. The PFL had carved out its own little corner with that unique season format and tournament structure, but they'd never really posed a serious threat to the UFC's grip on elite talent. Fighters saw them as either a stepping stone to UFC glory or a comfortable landing spot for those who got cut from the roster. Makhachev's signature on that PFL contract just completely flipped that perception, transforming the upstart promotion into a legitimate destination for the sport's absolute best. What makes this departure even more mind-blowing is where Makhachev sits in his career right now. He just accomplished one of his biggest dreams by capturing that second divisional championship, putting his name right next to legends like Daniel Cormier, Conor McGregor, Amanda Nunes, and Henry Cejudo as fighters who held UFC gold in multiple weight classes at the same time. His decision to vacate the lightweight title before pursuing welterweight gold had already stirred up controversy among fans who wanted to see that iconic image of Makhachev holding both belts. He defended that choice by saying that keeping the lightweight belt for over a year while chasing welterweight gold would be disrespectful to all the contenders waiting for their shot. Now that same sense of honor and respect for competition seems to be pointing him toward a completely new organization, one that apparently promises to give Makhachev the platform, the money, and the opponent selection flexibility that he felt the UFC wasn't willing to provide. You can't really understand Islam Makhachev's exit from the UFC without diving deep into all the controversies, rivalries, and behind-the-scenes drama that had been building up underneath his seemingly unstoppable championship run. Even though Makhachev had established himself as the most dominant force in the sport, his journey wasn't exactly smooth sailing, with several major bumps that tested both his reputation and his relationship with the organization that turned him into a global superstar. The ongoing war of words with lightweight champion Ilia Topuria had reached absolutely insane levels in the weeks before this announcement dropped. Topuria, the undefeated Georgian Spanish knockout machine, who captured the featherweight title before moving up to lightweight, had been repeatedly making threats against Khabib Nurmagomedov, who's basically Makhachev's mentor and the cornerstone of his entire training operation. These threats crossed lines that even combat sports promotion standards would consider way over the top. Topuria had actually said he would submit Makhachev, while literally stepping on Khabib's head if the legendary retired champion tried to get involved. Comments like that drew massive criticism from the entire MMA community, while simultaneously creating exactly the kind of controversy that promoters usually eat up. Makhachev had responded to these provocations with his typical calm demeanor, suggesting that Topuria seemed upset about something and they needed to figure out what was really driving all this aggressive behavior. The Dagestani champion had hinted at settling things either inside or outside the cage, but the underlying tension had clearly damaged his relationship with an organization that seemed more interested in promoting the drama than protecting its champions. The proposed super fight between Makhachev and Topuria had been getting described as potentially the biggest fight in UFC history, a collision between the consensus top 2 pound-for-pound fighters on the planet with legacy implications that went way beyond typical championship considerations. Dana White himself had repeatedly talked about making this fight happen, seeing it as a massive promotional goldmine, but sources close to the negotiations say the UFC's handling of this potential matchup became a major sticking point. Makhachev and his team allegedly felt like the organization was using Topuria's inflammatory comments as promotional fuel without properly protecting their fighter's reputation and that of his team. The controversy spread beyond the Topuria situation into questions about opponent selection that had been following Makhachev throughout his welterweight championship goals. His stated interest in defending against former champion Kamaru Usman, instead of rising contenders like undefeated Shavkat Rakhmonov or Ian Machado Gary, had drawn serious criticism from fans and fighters. Bilal Muhammad had publicly called out Makhachev for what he saw as planting seeds for an easier defense, pointing out that Usman's recent record of 1 win and 3 losses in his last 4 fights didn't really merit a title shot over hungrier, more dangerous contenders who had been earning their opportunities through consistent victories. Makhachev had defended his position by calling Usman the toughest stylistic matchup available, pointing to the former champion's wrestling background, extensive experience, and status as the holder of the most welterweight title defenses in UFC history. He viewed a potential Usman fight as a legacy-defining challenge rather than a calculated choice of a weakened opponent. This debate over matchmaking had exposed deeper tensions between Makhachev's vision for his career and the UFC's business priorities. The organization reportedly wanted to push him toward fights that would generate maximum pay-per-view revenue, while Makhachev and his team were prioritizing challenges that would cement his place in history regardless of their commercial appeal. Past controversies had also continued casting shadows over Makhachev's UFC career. Despite him being completely cleared of any wrongdoing, the 2016 meldonium positive test remained a talking point among critics. Even though USADA had ruled it as no fault or negligence, similar to many other athletes who tested positive for the heart medication during the period right after it got added to the banned substance list. More recently, the 2023 IV rehydration accusations following his UFC 2-4 victory over Alexander Volkanovski had created significant controversy. Dan Hooker had accused him of using a banned IV drip that exceeded permitted volumes, though Makhachev, his team, the UFC, USADA, and the relevant athletic commission all found zero evidence of wrongdoing. These cleared allegations had still continued fueling online speculation and criticism, creating an environment where Makhachev felt his achievements were being unfairly questioned, despite his extensive testing history showing over 40 clean tests in recent years. The competitive rivalry with Arman Tsarukyan had also remained unresolved in a way that might have contributed to Makhachev's frustration with his UFC situation. Their 2019 battle at UFC Fight Night 49 had been an absolute war that earned Fight of the Night honors, with Makhachev winning a close, unanimous decision against the highly touted prospect who pushed him harder than almost anyone in his career. A rematch had been scheduled for UFC 311 in January 2025 to determine the real top dog of the lightweight division, but Tsarukyan had been forced to withdraw due to injury, getting replaced by short-notice opponent Renato Moicano. Makhachev had finished Moicano with a first-round dark choke, but that highly anticipated showdown with Tsarukyan had once again slipped away. This sense of unfinished business, combined with the UFC's apparent inability or unwillingness to make the fights Makhachev wanted when he wanted them, had contributed to a growing disconnect between the champion and the organization. His fighting style had made him must-see television for technical experts, but hadn't always translated into the crossover appeal that the UFC prioritizes when building their biggest stars. Makhachev's grappling-heavy approach, rooted in Dagestani combat sambo and freestyle wrestling, emphasized control, patience, and relentless pressure rather than the spectacular knockouts that casual fans crave. His elite chain wrestling with body locks, trips, single and double leg takedowns, and seamless transitions had proven virtually unstoppable against the world's best competition. But some people had labeled his style as boring or unwatchable. The welterweight title victory over Jack Della Maddalena had perfectly exemplified this tension. Those scorecards reading 50-45 across the board represented total domination, yet the fight had drawn criticism for its lack of exciting exchanges. Makhachev had done exactly what his style demanded: close distance safely, avoid unnecessary risks, and grind out a dominant decision on the mat. His exceptional cardio and fight IQ had made him impossible to finish, but these same qualities had sometimes worked against him in the court of public opinion. The uncertainty you could hear in Dana White's voice when discussing Makhachev's future had been obvious, and sources suggest the champion had interpreted this uncertainty as evidence that the UFC wasn't willing to commit to the vision he had for his remaining fighting years. The personal side can't be ignored either. Makhachev, known for keeping his family life intensely private, has 3 children and a wife whose identity remains undisclosed in accordance with Dagestani cultural traditions. The demands of being a 2-division champion while maintaining his training base in Russia and traveling the world for promotional obligations had taken a toll that few people outside his inner circle really understood. The PFL, according to people familiar with the negotiations, had offered not just a financial package that completely dwarfed anything the UFC was willing to provide, but also scheduling flexibility and opponent selection input that would let Makhachev balance his championship goals with his responsibilities as a father and husband. The consequences of Islam, Makhachev's departure from the UFC, go way beyond one fighter's career path, touching every single aspect of the mixed martial arts landscape and potentially reshaping the competitive dynamics of the entire sport. For the UFC, this represents an absolutely unprecedented failure of fighter retention at the complete peak of an athlete's abilities. The organization has lost champions before to retirement, to other sports, and occasionally to rival promotions, but never has a fighter of Makhachev's caliber, dominance, and marketability walked away while holding a championship and standing on top of the pound-for-pound rankings. The immediate impact is going to hit the welterweight division hard, where Makhachev's departure leaves a championship vacuum that has to be filled through a process the UFC hasn't even announced yet. The most likely scenario involves an immediate title fight between top contenders, potentially matching up fighters like Shavkat Rakhmonov against Michael Morales, or another highly ranked competitor to determine a new champion. Those words from Dana White, spoken in a completely different context, now carry an almost prophetic quality. The UFC does have options for filling the welterweight void, but none of those options possess the star power, the win streak, or the pound-for-pound credibility that Makhachev brought every main event he headlined. The financial implications for the UFC are absolutely massive. Makhachev had been positioned as a cornerstone of the promotion's international expansion strategy, particularly in regions like Russia, the Middle East, and Central Asia, where his dominance and his connection to the legendary Khabib Nurmagomedov made him an unmatched draw for new audiences. That rumored White House card that Dana White had been teasing as a historic event now faces a huge obstacle. Makhachev had been widely expected to headline that card, potentially in a super fight against Ilia Topuria, or in a legacy defense against a top contender. Without him, the UFC has to find another attraction capable of justifying the political and logistical complexity of staging an event at such a prestigious venue. For the PFL, this signing represents complete validation of their ambitious strategy to challenge the UFC's dominance by acquiring elite talent willing to leave the sport's established leader. The organization had previously struggled to attract fighters at the absolute peak of their abilities, often serving as a destination for veterans on the decline or young prospects not yet ready for the UFC's pressure cooker. Makhachev changes that narrative completely. His presence in the PFL immediately elevates the organization's credibility and creates genuine intrigue about whether other top fighters might follow his lead. If the UFC's pound-for-pound best can find better opportunities elsewhere, what does that mean for champions and contenders who have been frustrated by their own compensation or treatment? The comparison to boxing's multi-promotional landscape becomes increasingly relevant. For decades, the UFC has maintained a near monopoly on elite mixed martial arts talent, with rival organizations unable to compete for the sport's biggest names. Makhachev's departure suggests this dynamic might be shifting, potentially leading to a future where top fighters can choose between legitimately competitive options rather than accepting whatever terms the UFC offers. The irony of these words spoken just weeks ago, when Dana White was positioning Makhachev for greatest of all time discussions and prestigious opportunities, cannot be lost on anyone following this story. The fighter who was supposed to define the UFC's 2026 will instead be headlining events for their biggest rival. For Makhachev himself, this move represents a calculated gamble with his legacy that could pay enormous dividends or leave questions that can never be answered. His resume inside the UFC octagon is virtually spotless. Victories over Charles Oliveira for the vacant lightweight title, 2 wins over Alexander Volkanovski, including a highlight reel knockout, a gutsy submission victory over Dustin Poirier, and a dominant championship performance against Jack Della Maddalena at welterweight. The question that will now follow him is whether the PFL can provide competition worthy of his talents. Critics will argue that leaving the UFC at his peak means we'll never know how he would have fared against Topuria, against a fully healthy Tsarukyan in a rematch, or against the murderer's row of welterweight contenders who had been circling for title shots. Supporters will counter that Makhachev has already proven everything he needs to prove, having submitted the submission king in Oliveira, knocked out the pound-for-pound great Volkanovski, and dominated everyone else placed in front of him with a combination of wrestling brilliance and increasingly dangerous striking. The path that brought Makhachev to this moment had been paved with sacrifice and determination that began long before he ever set foot inside the UFC octagon. Born in Makhachkala, Dagestan, and raised in the remote village of Burshi, he came from humble beginnings that forged the iron will required to reach the pinnacle of combat sports. His father worked as a driver and tomato farmer. His mother ran a small cafe, and young Islam was involved in the street fights common in the region long before formal martial arts training shaped his raw talents. Training under the legendary Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, Khabib's father and one of the most respected coaches in combat sports history, had instilled in Makhachev the technical foundation and mental discipline that would carry him to championship glory. When Abdulmanap passed away in 2020, the loss devastated the entire team, but also strengthened their resolve to honor his legacy through continued excellence. The brotherly bond between Makhachev and Khabib Nurmagomedov had been central to his development and will undoubtedly influence whatever comes next in the PFL. Khabib's role as mentor, training partner, and spiritual guide had shaped Makhachev into the complete fighter and human being who now stands at this crossroads in his career. Those aspirations for legacy fights at legendary venues had been central to Makhachev's vision for his final years as an active competitor. Whether the PFL can provide platforms comparable to Madison Square Garden, Abu Dhabi's Etihad Arena, or the proposed White House event remains to be seen. The organization will certainly try, backed by the financial resources necessary to stage spectacles worthy of their new star acquisition. The career clock that Makhachev has acknowledged played a significant role in this decision. At 34 years old, he has perhaps 3 to 4 years remaining at the elite level, and the PFL contract reportedly guarantees him more financial security for his family in that window than the UFC was willing to provide. His mentor Khabib Nurmagomedov's influence on this decision cannot be understated. Khabib, who retired undefeated and has since focused on developing fighters and business ventures, has consistently emphasized the importance of protecting one's legacy while also securing generational wealth. Makhachev's move aligns perfectly with the philosophy that Khabib has promoted since walking away from the sport at the top of his game. Dana White's quick pivot to discussing other fighters in that interview now reads as almost prescient, as if the UFC president was already preparing for a future without his biggest male star. The organization's deep roster means there will always be compelling matchups to promote, but losing the pound-for-pound best creates a void that no amount of marketing can fully compensate for. The MMA community's reaction has been predictably split. Longtime fans who respect fighter autonomy and believe in competitive markets have celebrated Makhachev's decision as a blow against monopolistic control. Others, particularly those invested in seeing potential super fights and legacy-defining matchups inside the UFC octagon, have expressed disappointment that some dream fights will never materialize. What can't be disputed is that this moment represents a turning point in the sport's history. The UFC's grip on elite talent has weakened for the first time in meaningful ways, and the consequences of that shift will play out over years rather than months. For Islam Makhachev, the Dagestani dominator who trained under Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, who carries on the legacy of Khabib's legendary career and who compiled one of the most impressive resumes in UFC history, a new chapter begins. His record of 28-1 stands as testament to his dominance. His 16-fight winning streak ties the all-time UFC record, and his collection of championship belts includes titles in 2 weight classes. Whether the PFL can provide challenges worthy of that legacy remains the biggest question hanging over this entire situation. But one thing is absolutely certain: the world of mixed martial arts will never be quite the same after the day Islam Makhachev officially quit the UFC to join the Professional Fighters League. The training camp that Khabib recently opened in the mountains of Dagestan, the one that Makhachev had spoken so fondly about in recent interviews, will now serve as headquarters for a team that operates outside the UFC ecosystem. The beautiful but dangerous roads leading to that remote facility, the horses that Makhachev has been collecting at his farm, the quiet family life he guards so protectively from public scrutiny, all of these elements of his existence outside the octagon will continue unchanged even as his professional circumstances undergo this radical transformation. The MMA world watches now, with held breath to see what comes next. Will other dissatisfied UFC champions follow Makhachev's lead to the PFL? Will the competition between organizations drive up fighter compensation across the board? Will the super fights that seemed possible in the UFC octagon somehow materialize across promotional lines through the kind of cross-promotional agreements that have become common in boxing? These questions will take months and years to answer fully. For now, what we know with absolute certainty is that Islam Makhachev, the pound-for-pound best fighter on the planet, the man who conquered 2 UFC divisions and tied the all-time win streak record, has made the most shocking career decision in modern MMA history, and nothing about the sport will ever look quite the same again.